They call me Olivia Bennett, 27 years old. I pull night shifts at the emergency room. And if you ask my mom, I'm nothing but a parasite. She didn't whisper it during some heated argument in private. No, she declared it right there at our Thanksgiving dinner, one hand gripping the carving knife while the other clutched her wine glass. She looked straight at me and announced to everyone, "To Olivia, our little Leech. November's your final month living here. It's time you learned to be an adult." The silence hit so hard I could actually hear the furnace running down in the basement. My sister just stared down at her plate like it was the most fascinating thing she'd ever seen. My stepdad cleared his throat and pretended to slice more turkey that nobody even wanted. Some kid at the table asked what a leech was, and one of the adults laughed, like mom had just told a hilarious joke. Not a single person said that was crossing the line. Nobody mentioned that I'd paid for half the food on that table. They just sat there, waiting for me to break down crying or start begging for forgiveness. I refused to give them that satisfaction. Instead, I cut myself a piece of turkey, forced it down past the massive lump in my throat, and said the only words I could trust myself to speak. "Pass the gravy." I played along for the rest of the evening, nodded at all the fake small talk, and let that painfully long night drag itself to an end. But something inside me had clicked into place. If they genuinely believed I was just some parasite draining their resources, then my departure shouldn't hurt them one bit. By the time everyone in that house had gone to bed, I'd already made my decision. I knew exactly what I was packing, which bills I was canceling, and how I was leaving without saying a word. What I didn't expect was who would show up at my new apartment the very next day, acting like absolutely nothing had changed. If you've ever been treated like a burden by your own family, stick with me through this whole story. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss what happened after I walked out. Waking up the next morning felt strange. My thoughts were sharper than my emotions, like my brain had already decided what my heart was just now starting to understand. That mental clarity made it easier to trace back the long chain of events that led me to that dinner table. None of it had erupted overnight. It had built up slowly and quietly, like how cold seeps through the walls of these old Burlington houses. Gradual, unnoticed, and then suddenly everywhere. I'd moved back into my mother's house a little over a year before, when Christine Bennett had some health problems. Nothing dramatic enough to land her in the hospital, but serious enough to make me feel responsible. Leaving my own apartment to move in with her seemed temporary at first, like I was just making the practical choice. Working nights at the ER meant I barely saw daylight anyway, and saving money on rent seemed like the only smart financial decision I'd made in ages. For a while, I convinced myself that playing the role of the reliable daughter wasn't something I minded stepping back into. Her husband, my stepdad Kenneth Bennett, didn't object when I carried my boxes through the door. But then again, Kenneth didn't object to much of anything, unless it somehow benefited him directly. He treated my presence like just another household appliance, quiet, available, and useful whenever needed. I didn't pick up on it right away, but eventually I realized that whenever something broke down or a bill showed up in the mail, he'd just wait for me to handle it, like it was the most natural thing in the world, like flipping a light switch. The man had this remarkable talent for vanishing whenever any actual responsibility entered the room. Then there's my sister, Melissa Parker. She's the shining example of what Christine thinks a daughter should look like. Married, with kids, owns a house, and maintains a schedule that appears perfect on paper, even though the reality is complete chaos. Melissa never hesitated to lean on me whenever she needed a babysitter or someone to fill in the gaps she left open. I kept telling myself I didn't mind helping out. But the truth was less noble than that. I just wanted to avoid disappointing anyone. I'd spent my entire life trying to become the version of myself that my family could accept. even when that version barely looked like the person I was actually becoming. The convenience of having me around the house slowly transformed into expectation. Expectation became dependence, and in their language, dependence translated into complete silence. No acknowledgments, no thank yous, not even an occasional nod of appreciation. Whenever something functioned properly in that house, it worked because I'd handled it. The internet plan was registered under my name. The gas bill came to my account. The electric bill, water bill, even all the streaming services, my credit card, every single one of them. Month after month, I kept convincing myself it wasn't that big of a deal, that I could afford it, that family members help each other out. But somewhere deep in the back of my mind, I understood I was carrying more weight than anyone cared to admit. The strange part was how invisible all that effort seemed to them. When the refrigerator was stocked with food, they just assumed it had always been full. When heat flowed through the vents during those brutal Burlington winters, they assumed it happened automatically. When the Wi-Fi connected instantly without issues, nobody imagined it was paid for by the same paycheck that covered my medical scrubs, my share of rent, and my student loans. It was easier for them to see me as the daughter who'd come back home than the person who was actually keeping the home functioning. Even my mother used my presence as a way to maintain the illusion that her household was still running smoothly. She liked people to think everything was under control, that she was the type of woman whose adult daughters came home out of affection, not because of necessity. Whenever I tried discussing boundaries or sharing the strain I was feeling, she acted like I was being ungrateful, as if having a room in her house somehow erased all the years of support I'd quietly provided. The imbalance wasn't loud or violent. It grew in all the spaces where gratitude should have existed. Every small dismissal, every shrug, every reminder that I was still trying to figure my life out pushed me a little further away. The more I stepped in to fill those gaps, the less anyone seemed to notice I was doing it. By the time the holidays rolled around, the pattern felt permanent. Christine had perfected her subtle comparisons. Melissa, the accomplished one. Me, the unsettled one. Kenneth assumed I'd cover anything he forgot about. Melissa assumed I had endless amounts of time and energy, and I assumed none of them would ever truly recognize the cost of the role I was playing. The fault line was already there beneath the surface. The ground had already shifted. What happened at Thanksgiving didn't create the break. It simply revealed what was already fractured. I'd spent so long trying to rationalize their expectations that I barely noticed how far I'd drifted from my true self. The more I tried holding everything together, the more invisible I became in the house I was helping to keep warm. Looking back now, the warning signs had always been visible. The exhaustion sitting heavy in my chest after pulling double shifts. The resentment I tried swallowing whenever my phone lit up with yet another request. The quiet ache I felt when I realized I couldn't remember the last time anyone asked how I was doing without needing something in return. I'd convinced myself this was what loyalty looked like. But loyalty without acknowledgement isn't loyalty at all. It's erosion. Steady, silent, and devastating. By the time November arrived with its early darkness and heavy gray skies, that erosion had already hollowed out everything I thought I had left to give. Morning arrived before I felt ready to face it, the kind of morning that doesn't ask permission to show up. I sat on the edge of my bed for several minutes, letting the stillness press against my chest. There was no written plan, no checklist taped to my wall. Yet everything in me moved with the calm certainty of someone who'd already rehearsed this moment countless times in the quiet corners of her mind. I didn't need anger to guide me. Clarity was more than enough. The first thing I did was grab my laptop and open the browser. Logging into various accounts had become so routine that my fingers moved without any hesitation. The internet service was under my name, one bill I'd never missed paying. I stared at that account page for a moment, not out of any sentimental feeling, but because it struck me as strange how much responsibility I'd been carrying without ever actually calling it responsibility. Then I pressed the button. Service scheduled to terminate. Confirmation email arrived a second later. It felt precise, almost surgical. Not an act of revenge, just a clean boundary being drawn. Next came the utilities. Gas first, then electric, then water. Each account showed months of payments I'd made automatically, never pausing to question how unusual it was for someone my age to be paying for an entire household that wasn't actually mine. Turning off the autopay felt like sliding a massive weight off my shoulders. There was no guilt in those actions, only this unexpected sensation of reclaiming something I'd given away too freely. The subscriptions came after that. Streaming platforms, cloud storage, those small monthly services that seemed harmless individually, but added up in ways nobody else ever acknowledged. I changed passwords methodically, one after another, amazed at how quietly I'd set up the entire digital world that household depended on. None of them had ever questioned where these conveniences came from. They simply assumed they existed. Once my accounts were handled, I finally turned my attention to the room itself. Packing didn't take long. I owned fewer possessions than most people my age, partly because my schedule left little time for hobbies, partly because living in my mother's house made me feel like the space wasn't truly mine to fill. Clothes, work scrubs, a handful of books, a shoebox full of old letters, and a folder containing financial documents. Everything fit into 2 bags and an old duffel I'd kept since college. I didn't linger over objects or try to preserve memories that had already faded away. There was no need to make this moment heavier than it already was. The house around me stayed quiet. No footsteps in the hallway, no creaking bathroom door, no sounds coming from the kitchen. It struck me how often I'd adapted myself to avoid disturbing anyone, always moving gently, always accommodating everyone else. That habit felt unnecessary now. I walked down the hallway carrying my bags and didn't look back at the room where I'd slept for months. It had never felt like a sanctuary, just a temporary landing spot in a place that used my presence more than it welcomed it. I set my keys on the kitchen counter. Not carefully, not dramatically, just placed them there so there'd be no question later. If they wanted to know why the heat stopped working or why the Wi-Fi went down, they wouldn't be able to pretend they didn't understand. Those keys made a soft sound against the counter, like a tiny punctuation mark at the end of an unspoken sentence. Leaving that house felt different than I'd imagined. I'd expected tension in my chest, some final surge of doubt, maybe even a whisper of guilt. But the air outside was cold and clean, and that weight I'd anticipated never materialized. This wasn't an escape. It wasn't even defiance. It was simply the next step in a truth I'd already accepted. I couldn't keep living in a place that saw me as a placeholder rather than a person. I loaded my bags into the backseat of my car. The engine started without any trouble, humming in a way that felt reassuring. The streets of Burlington were quiet, the kind of quiet that usually made me feel small and insignificant. But today, it felt like space. Room to breathe, room to think, room to exist without being measured against someone else's expectations. As I pulled away from that house, I didn't check my mirrors for one final glimpse. The life behind me wasn't something I needed to memorialize. The only thing that mattered was the path ahead, however uncertain or imperfect it might turn out to be. And for the first time in ages, that uncertainty didn't frighten me. When I reached the small apartment I'd secured earlier in the week, I carried my bags upstairs one at a time. The stairwell smelled like dust and old paint, but it felt honest in a way that house I'd left never had. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and set my things down on the scuffed wooden floor. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Every crack, every imperfection, every inch of that space belonged to me and nobody else. There was no need to declare anything or assign some dramatic meaning to the moment. Standing in that quiet apartment, I simply allowed myself to exist without carrying anyone else's weight. And for now, that was more than enough. Evening settled in quietly, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for permission. It just spreads itself across the walls until it becomes part of the air itself. Standing in the middle of my new apartment, I realized how unfamiliar the silence felt. Not uncomfortable, just different. Like discovering space I hadn't known I needed. There were no footsteps overhead, no clattering in the kitchen, no murmurs drifting down a hallway. Just the soft hum of the radiator struggling against another freezing Burlington night. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, letting the emptiness of the room wrap around me. The place wasn't impressive by any measure. Paint was chipped in several spots, and the floor curved slightly near the entryway, but it grounded me in a way that made the chaos I'd left behind feel distant and irrelevant. The simplicity felt earned. For once, I wasn't trying to shrink myself to avoid intruding on someone else's space. I didn't have to calculate how much noise I was making or worry about how anyone might interpret my presence. This was the first space in years where every corner belonged completely to me. My phone buzzed for the first time a little after sunset. The sound echoed through the apartment, sharp enough to cut through the calm. I didn't pick it up right away. Instead, I watched the screen glow on the floor beside my bag. A message preview appeared with a familiar contact name sitting at the top. It didn't surprise me one bit. It only reinforced a truth I'd been circling around all day. The moment I stepped out of that house, a balance they'd never even noticed had shifted dramatically. The message was brief, almost dismissive in tone, as if nothing significant had occurred. Just a simple question about the Wi-Fi, phrased like routine maintenance. It was strange how easy it was for them to treat my labor like a default setting, something they assumed would continue even without me physically being there. The expectation itself felt heavier than the actual words. I didn't open the message. I didn't need to. The preview told me everything I needed to know about what they were really asking. Return to the role they'd built for me. Keep their world running smoothly. Pretend none of the last 24 hours had any meaning. Another message arrived shortly after. This one was longer, more frazzled around the edges. Not frantic, not apologetic, just uncomfortable in a way that suggested inconvenience rather than genuine concern. It mentioned a movie not loading and a child being upset about it. The subtext was crystal clear. Even in my absence, they expected my patience to stretch across the distance to fill the holes they'd never bothered patching themselves. I placed the phone face down on the floor. The weight of the silence that followed felt strangely liberating. With the apartment dimly lit by a single lamp I'd brought from the old house, I allowed myself to lie back and stare at the ceiling. The plaster was uneven, textured in a way that caught shadows and made them shift with every small movement of the lamp's glow. Those imperfections felt almost comforting, a reminder that not everything needed to be polished to serve a purpose. I wasn't looking for perfection, just a place where I didn't have to justify my existence. The air inside the apartment was cold, but not harsh. The radiator clanked sporadically, fighting to warm the room. In my mother's house, heat had flowed effortlessly, unnoticed, because I made certain it did. Here, warmth felt like a collaboration between the building and me. A fragile truce that made me appreciate every bit of comfort the room struggled to provide. I wrapped myself in an old sweatshirt and listened to the pipes settling. Night deepened, and the glow from streetlights outside cast faint stripes across the floor. I hadn't realized how exhausted I was until my breathing slowed and the tension in my shoulders finally eased. The absence of obligations felt almost dizzying. No one calling my name down a hallway. No one asking for yet another favor. No one hinting that I wasn't doing enough. Even my own thoughts felt quieter, more contained, no longer overshadowed by the constant pressure to anticipate someone else's needs. As I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to relax into the silence, my phone lit up again. The buzz was softer this time, almost hesitant. I didn't touch it. I let it fade on its own, returning the room to stillness. The choice not to respond didn't feel vindictive. It felt necessary. A way of marking a boundary I should have drawn a long time ago. That world on the other side of those messages no longer defined who I was, and I didn't owe it my energy anymore. Eventually, I stood up and looked around the apartment once more. The bare walls, the empty floor, the single lamp casting its glow. Everything felt like a blank beginning, not a loss. I didn't know what the next day would bring. I didn't know what adjustments I'd have to make, or how long it would take before this space fully felt like home. But in that moment, the uncertainty wasn't frightening. The quiet wasn't a threat. It was a pause. A rare chance to hear my own thoughts without interruption. For the first time in ages, the night belonged entirely to me. Morning arrived with a low haze drifting through the apartment windows, giving the room a muted softness that didn't match the tension building in my chest. I'd barely finished organizing a small stack of essentials when a sudden, deliberate knock echoed through the hallway. The sound cut through the stillness in a way that told me this wasn't a delivery person, a neighbor, or some mistake. It carried a weight I recognized instantly, a weight I'd hoped I wouldn't have to face this soon. The moment I opened the door, the expression on Kenneth Bennett's face told me everything I needed to know. He looked completely out of place against the worn frame of my apartment doorway, like someone pulled out of a familiar script and dropped into a scene he didn't understand. The discomfort in his eyes wasn't concern. It was disruption. Something in his carefully maintained world had slipped, and he'd come here to restore it. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, scanning the apartment as if trying to measure the gap between the life he expected me to live and the one I was choosing instead. I could feel the judgment in the way he glanced at the empty shelves and plain walls, but what struck me more was the irritation beneath it. Not worry, irritation. As if my absence had inconvenienced him more than it had actually unsettled the household. There was no need for him to speak for me to understand exactly why he was standing there. The look on his face held a familiar urgency, the kind that had appeared in small ways over the past year, whenever something in the house didn't function the way he wanted. Heat, internet, streaming services, payments he'd never tracked because he assumed someone else would handle them, that someone had always been me. Standing there now, watching him shift his weight uncomfortably, I felt the full reality of what I'd been carrying for so long. None of them had ever been responsible for the structure that kept their lives comfortable. And now that structure had collapsed the instant I stepped away. It wasn't surprising, but seeing the consequences appear so quickly gave me a clarity I hadn't expected. As he stood in the center of my apartment, I let my thoughts run through the long list of responsibilities I'd quietly shouldered. The electric bill, the gas line, the streaming accounts. All those small conveniences no one had ever paused to appreciate. All those invisible threads I'd woven into the household, threads nobody noticed until they snapped. The silence that followed was thick with everything he wasn't saying and everything I'd known for months but had refused to acknowledge. Being confronted so soon after leaving might have rattled me under different circumstances, but instead it made something crystallize inside me. I saw clearly the roles we'd all been playing. Kenneth's frustration wasn't rooted in concern for my well-being. It was rooted in the sudden realization that he now had to pick up tasks he'd ignored for years, tasks he didn't understand, didn't want, and didn't know how to handle. The ease of blaming me was gone because I was no longer part of the machinery keeping that household running. He looked at me in a way that suggested he expected some kind of explanation, an apology, maybe a reversal of my decision. something to make his appearance worthwhile. But there was nothing inside me that matched those expectations. The emotional distance between us had grown steadily over time, widening every time he dismissed the work I did or the strain I carried. Now, standing inches away from me, he felt like a stranger demanding access to a version of me that no longer existed. My mind drifted to the countless moments when I'd covered for the family without hesitation. Long shifts followed by late-night bill payments, small repairs, solutions to problems they didn't even know existed. I remembered the exhaustion that clung to me on days when everything pressed down at once. My job, their demands, the silence that swallowed any acknowledgement I might have hoped for. I'd been a resource, a function, a tool, rarely a person. Seeing Kenneth here in this place I'd built for myself made it clear how deeply that dynamic had rooted itself. The urgency in his presence didn't reflect concern for me. It reflected fear of losing access to what I provided. There was something sobering in that realization, something both painful and liberating. I didn't owe explanations to a man who'd never truly seen me. I didn't owe comfort to a household that only valued me when I made their lives easier. He waited as if expecting me to fill the silence with solutions, but silence, for once, felt like power. It filled the room with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. Without raising my voice or justifying a single decision, I let him stand in the truth of what my absence meant. Not punishment, not revenge. Just a boundary drawn so firmly in the ground that neither of us could pretend it wasn't there. I didn't move toward him. I didn't open the door wider. I didn't offer anything to soften the moment. The only thing I allowed myself to feel was the quiet certainty that I'd finally stepped out of a role that never should have been mine in the first place. The apartment settled into a familiar stillness after Kenneth left. A stillness that wrapped around me like a reminder that this space finally belonged to me alone. I moved through the room slowly, adjusting a stack of folded blankets, shifting a small lamp closer to the corner, letting my hands drift over surfaces I could call my own. The quiet didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like a boundary holding its shape. The air carried a strange brightness, almost as if the walls themselves had exhaled after years of pressure I didn't realize I'd been carrying. I hadn't expected the house to unravel so quickly after I walked away, but the steady rhythm of notifications that began gathering on my phone made it clear how deeply my absence had cut through their routines. Each alert vibrated across the countertop like a small knock, asking to be let inside. I didn't rush to read them. The mere sound of the phone buzzing was enough to tell me that someone back home had realized another problem they couldn't fix. When I finally glanced at the screen, I saw the pattern immediately. Missed calls, text previews stacked one after another, timestamps creeping across the morning hours. None of them held anger the way I would have expected. Instead, I sensed disorientation. A quiet panic slipping through the cracks of every message. It was the kind of shift that happens when certainty evaporates all at once. The tone I recognized best was desperation disguised as concern. My mind drifted over the years that had built up to this moment, the many times I'd absorbed responsibility without acknowledging its weight. I remembered evenings when I'd dragged myself home after shifts at the hospital, completely drained but still alert enough to pay attention to the things nobody else noticed. The overdue statement on the counter, the blinking router, the thermostat running hotter than it should. I picked up every detail instinctively because that household only worked if someone did, and that someone had always been me. Now, seeing the incoming messages pile up, I realized how deeply they'd depended on the structure I'd created behind the scenes. The illusion of stability had never rested on family unity. It rested on my willingness to fill the gaps everyone else stepped around. As soon as I stepped back, those gaps widened into something they couldn't ignore. The next wave of notifications came in softer, almost hesitant, as if the senders weren't sure how much space they still had in my life. A few names I expected appeared on the screen, each carrying their own brand of unease. There was a faint thread running through all of them, a plea layered under excuses, a suggestion that I should return because it would be the reasonable thing to do. The implication that distance would only make things harder for them, not for me. As I scrolled through the messages, the realization struck with quiet force. They weren't reaching out because they wanted to understand me. They were reaching out because they couldn't function without what I provided. It was a distinction I'd ignored for far too long, and seeing it now made something settle inside me like a heavy truth finally landing in its rightful place. The room around me felt sturdier as that thought grew clearer. I wasn't responsible for the consequences they now faced. I wasn't responsible for fixing the aftermath of decisions they'd made without considering what it cost me. I wasn't responsible for soothing the discomfort that came from being confronted with their own neglect. What they felt now wasn't grief, it was loss of convenience. The more the messages came in, the more I sensed a shift I hadn't allowed myself to name before. My pulse didn't quicken. My chest didn't tighten with anxiety. I didn't feel that familiar pull to smooth things over and make everything okay. Instead, I felt a widening distance that didn't hurt. It steadied me. This wasn't retaliation. It wasn't even anger anymore. It was clarity. The kind that forms when a person steps outside the structure that was confining them and realizes how small that structure actually was. I knew I'd keep receiving messages, maybe even more frantic ones, but none of them had the power to undo the boundary I'd drawn. The phone buzzed again, vibrating against the countertop in a steady rhythm. I let it ring. I didn't need to read every word to understand what they were asking for. The household was unraveling, the roles were collapsing, and the silence on my end was louder than any argument I could have offered. I stepped away from the phone, letting it buzz unanswered while I pulled open a window to let in a breath of cold air. The breeze slipped into the room and carried a quiet sharpness that reminded me why I'd left. It reminded me that not every call demanded a response, not every plea required a return, and not every crisis belonged to me. The messages kept coming, but the distance between us had already settled, firm and unshakable. For the first time, that weight wasn't sitting on my shoulders. The consequences were landing exactly where they belonged. Time kept moving after everything broke apart. I went to work, came back to my small apartment, paid my own bills, and built routines that belonged only to me. The house in Burlington where I'd grown up became just another address, no longer the center of my life. The fallout followed by mail. Envelopes showed up in my mailbox with my name stamped across the front, listing balances for gas, electric, and services I'd set up for a family I no longer lived with. One letter came from the property management company handling my mother's rental. Utility shutoffs and unpaid amounts were now creating problems for the lease. My name sat in the middle of the page as the primary account holder. I'd left that house, but on paper I was still tied to it. If I wanted a clean future, I had to cut those strings. That's when my Aunt Gloria stepped in. She'd always stayed at the edge of family drama, seeing more than she ever said out loud. Now she was the first person to reach out without asking me to come back or fix anything. When Gloria came to my apartment, she brought a folder full of copies and notes. She'd already called the landlord and the utility companies. At my small table, she laid out every page with my name on it and calmly explained what needed to be done so I could walk away without debt or damage to my credit. For the first time, someone treated my situation as something unfair to me, not as an inconvenience to everyone else. Signing those forms felt heavier than I'd expected. With every signature, one more thread tying me to that house loosened. I wasn't erasing the help I'd given. I was ending the assumption that it would never stop. News about the old house reached me in fragments. Gloria mentioned that the landlord refused to renew the lease without a significantly larger deposit after all the utility trouble. My mother and Kenneth had to move into a smaller place they could actually afford on their own. Melissa picked up extra work hours and arranged childcare that didn't depend on me. Their lives adjusted to what they could carry themselves. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like things finally matched reality. My own life became simple and solid. I picked up extra shifts when I wanted more savings, not because I was afraid of another surprise bill showing up. I bought small things for my apartment because they made it feel like home. I stocked my pantry with food I chose myself. Paying my own utilities felt straightforward. I knew what I used and what I owed, and nobody else's comfort was hiding behind my name. Sometimes my phone still lit up with messages from my mother. Some tried to soften the past, as if careful wording could somehow rewrite what was said at that dinner table. Others leaned on guilt and shared history, trying to pull me back through obligation. I read them less and less often, and replied even less frequently. Distance didn't erase the years between us, but it finally put a limit on what those years could demand from me. The word that had split everything wide open stayed with me for a while. Leech. It sat in the back of my mind, sharp and ugly. But as my days filled with choices that were finally mine to make, that label started falling apart. It didn't match the facts. It fit the narrative of people who needed a story where I was the problem. One night, sitting at my own table with a simple dinner and a few notes from work spread out in front of me, the whole thing finally came into focus. This had never been just about heat, Wi-Fi, or whose name appeared on which bill. It was about who gets to define the value of your effort while standing on top of it. It was about how quickly people call you selfish the moment you stop letting them take without limit. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's that being needed isn't the same as being respected. Carrying your family doesn't mean you owe them your future or your silence. Sometimes the clearest way to protect yourself is to stand up from a table where you're being fed, blame instead of gratitude, and walk away without apologizing. I didn't plan anyone's hardship. I didn't sabotage their lives. I simply stepped out of the space where I'd been absorbing all the consequences. The house adjusted to my absence because it had to. I adjusted to my freedom because I finally chose to. And they learned what life looked like without the person they'd once called a leech.